Hi guys, we're back again, and we're going to be doing some more historical accounts detailing how swords were used in periods from the actual authors, from the actual sources. So this time we're going to be talking about swords used during the Crusades, so talking about European encounters with Islamic forces, primarily in the Holy Lands. So to do this, we're going to be looking at the works written by one of the most prolific authors of the period. So we're going all the way back to really the 12th century. And in this case, we're going to be looking at the works of Usama ibn Munqidh, Munqidh, who is one of the most famous or well-known authors of this period. He was born in Syria, but he traveled extensively throughout the Middle East, so way up into modern day Iraq and Syria, all the way down into Egypt, and throughout the Levant, and has extensive uh, accounts detailing all sorts of happenings with the geopolitics of what's going on both in the Islamic world as well as the newcomers. So he really talks about what's happening, uh, dealing with the fallout of the First Crusade as it's coming in. And it's really quite interesting. There we'll have to talk about a couple points of vocabulary as we get into it. But what type of swords are being used in this period? What's going on in the 12th century? If we just pull up Google, or if you think back to historically how depictions in books or famous movies like Kingdom of Heaven will depict the forces of European soldiers coming into the Holy Lands, fighting up against the Saracens, you'll have two swords in mind, which were probably not very well represented in this period. On the European side, the most common sword that is depicted in modern media is a longsword, meaning a sword that can be comfortably used in two hands. At this period in time, in the 12th century, these would be incredibly rare. While we have very limited examples of two-handed swords in use during the 12th century, they would have been an exceedingly scarce item. Instead, single-handed swords would have been the most common item of the day. On the side of the Muslim forces, the most common sword that's depicted in modern media is something that looks like this, often called a scimitar. This is a type of curved saber. In this specific case, the example I'm showing here is from the Ottoman Turks, and this would be called a kilage. While this specific type of sword would be common in, let's say, the 16th or 17th century, in the 12th century, this type of sword would be a scarcity. Now, were there Turks operating in the area at the time? Yes, and we're going to see that. And if Turks in the Turkic people's forces, so for instance, the Seljuk Turks had recently taken over large portions of Anatolia and were a large power in the Muslim world at the time. And these Central Asian forces that sometimes were operated as Mamluks, or kind of like indentured servants, they could bring swords like this, which were effectively a type of very long, thin saber, sometimes with or without a back edge to them. So to say that there weren't any sabers in the Holy Land at this point is probably an oversimplification, but they were probably a minority. So what swords are we seeing? So on the part of the Crusaders, as mentioned before, a single-handed, double-edged straight sword, a sword that has a crucifix, or a crossguard rather, a pommel of some kind, usually round, but there are other shapes of pommel, and a reasonably narrow grip that can accommodate one hand rather snugly. And again, a broad, a double-edged blade, oftentimes with a fuller. And in modern terms, we would call these arming swords or knightly style swords. Recently, there was a sword found off the coast of Israel, off the coast of Haifa, that um, has been dated to around the time of the Crusades, that has a truly spectacular crossguard on it that shows the type of proportions that swords of this period are using. But what about on the side of the Islamic forces? So we mentioned that the Islamic Turks might have sabers occasionally, but for the rest of the Islamic forces, the Arabs, they would actually have had swords very similar to that of the Europeans. At the time, very straight swords that are double-edged and relatively straight with small guards at the end of them. This is not a perfect example, but this is a sword that would have not been very out of place in the Islamic world at the time. They would have just been called saif, which means sword. And we hear examples in accounts of the time of them capturing European swords and being able to adapt to them quite easily. So the differences between the swords of the Europeans and the Islamic forces at this time are not terribly great. So with that discussion out of the way, we'll mention again that Usama was an extensive writer. He lived to age 93 and basically lived throughout the entirety of the 12th century and wrote on a variety of different topics. And he got to see all aspects of kind of the geopolitics that were going on in the Holy Lands. His collected work that I'm going to be reading from today is called The Book of Contemplations, Islam and the Crusades. If anyone's interested in the topic, I would recommend reading the entire book. I am only going to be reading on selective passages today, most of which are going to be detailing how swords were used again in period, and maybe a couple other anecdotes that I find particularly interesting. But again, I would recommend anyone who finds the topic interesting to go ahead and look up the book and read everything, because Usama is really an amazing author. As always, I'll put up a pronunciation disclaimer. I may stumble over some of the place names and terms, so anyone out there who is an Arabic scholar who can help me out with some of the pronunciations, feel free to drop them in the comments. This first account is going to be about him recounting an assassination attempt. So, ninjas in the palace. He recounts, Al-Zafir and Nasar were the same age, and they used to go out together at night in disguise. So Nasar invited the Caliph over to his house, which was by the sword-maker's market. Having set up a band of his companions to one side of the house, as soon as the Caliph was settled in the sitting room, Nasar's men rushed out at him and killed him. That was Wednesday night, the last night of Muharram of the year, which is 1154 AD. They threw him into a deep well in Nasar's house. A black servant of the Caliph's had accompanied him, a man called Sayyid al-Dwala, who never used to leave his side. They killed him too. The next morning, Thursday, Abbas went to the palace to give his usual to give his greetings, and took a seat in a side chamber in the Vizierate assembly hall, as if he were waiting for Al-Zafir to come and hold audience and receive greetings. We were sitting in the portico when more than 1,000 Egyptian troops in the palace, when we were surprised to see a bunch of men burst out of the audience chamber into the hall, and then hear the sounds of swords striking someone. So I said to one of the attendants, an Armenian, "Go and see who was killed." And off he went. When he came back to me, he told me, "Those men are no Muslims. That was my lord Abu al-Amana they killed," meaning the Emir Jibril. "One of them cut open his stomach and was yanking out his intestines." Then Abbas came out dragging the Emir Yusuf, the latter's naked head clutched under his armpit. He had already struck Yusuf with a sword, for blood was pouring out of him. Abu al-Baka and his nephew was in the hands of Nasar, so they brought the two of them into a side chamber in the palace and killed them there. And yet all this occurred while there were 1,000 swords unsheathed in the palace. That day was one of the most disquieting days I have ever lived through, given all the hideous injustices that occurred, injustices condemned by God, may he be exalted, and all his creatures. So that was quite the gory story, but he makes a point that this character, Al-Zafir, was able to make a power play, or Abbas was able to make a power play even while in the middle of 1,000 swords inside of the palace. Very interesting. Next up, he's out riding, and it sounds like he gets attacked. Once we had left Victory Gate behind us, the Arab tribes whom Abbas had made to swear oaths came together, and they fought us from the early morning hours of Friday until Thursday, from the 29th of May to the 4th of June, 1154. So they fought for several days. They spent every daylight hour fighting us. Once night fell and we encamped, they let us be so that we could sleep. Then they would ride at us with 100 horsemen, pressing at us with their horses from all sides, raising their voices in shouts. If any of our horses were startled and ran to them, they took it. One day, I withdrew from my comrades. I was riding a white horse, one of my worst. The groom had saddled him without knowing what would happen, and I had no weapons with me except my sword. Suddenly, the Arabs attacked me, and there I was. I couldn't find any way to repulse them. My horse couldn't help me escape, and their arrows started falling on me. I thought to myself, jump off the horse, draw your sword, and have at them. But as I gathered myself to jump, my horse stumbled, and I fell onto some stones and a patch of rough ground. A piece of skin from my head was ripped off, and I became so dizzy that I didn't know where I was. A group of Arabs gathered around me, while I just sat there, bareheaded, clueless, my sword lying in its scabbard. One of them struck me twice with his sword, saying, "Hand over the dosh!" But I didn't know what he was saying, so they took my horse and my sword. The Turks caught sight of me and doubled back. Nassar had sent me a horse and a sword, and I set off without having bandaged a dress on my wounds. Glory be to he whose kingdom lasts forever. So it sounds like he got rescued by his Turkish companions in this case, but the way that he phrases it here, and in the context of other writings, which perhaps we'll get into, he is carrying a sword, but in this case, that seems like the minimum amount of armament that he could possibly go out wearing. He obviously feels almost naked having it, like he is protected, but only just barely protected. He would much prefer to be armed with even more weapons than just a sword. And now some accounts from the Battle of Karfatab. So this is going to be them battling the Franks. So I haven't mentioned it before, but in his writings, he'll refer to any of the Crusaders or any of the Europeans as Franks, even though the Europeans, as they came in, were a multinational group. So there were Italians, and there were Germans, and there were folks from the Eastern Roman Empire. The French contingent made up perhaps the largest amount of the force, so there's a tendency for them to refer to any of the Europeans as Franks. So whenever you see Franks, it just means European in this case, or Christian in this case. And through the magic of editing, absolutely no time has passed. Let's continue with the accounts. So they're basically assaulting Crusaders at this fort. The Franks now turned upon our men and shot them with arrows, wounding the one who was first to climb up. So we went back down, but the other men continued to climb until they were facing the Franks on the parapet between the two tower walls. In the front of them rose a tower with a doorway, in which stood an armored horseman with a shield and spear, preventing entrance to the tower. On top of the tower was a group of Franks attacking our men with arrows and stones. So again, stones play a very big part of the armament of battle during this period of time. It's worth mentioning here. One of the Turks climbed up while we were watching and abandoned himself to fortune, walked forward until he approached the tower, and hurled a bottle of naphtha on those who were on top of it. I saw it blaze like a shooting star on the stones, while those Franks threw themselves on the ground out of fear of getting burned. So he has some sort of a flammable concoction. I'm not sure exactly what naphtha translates into here. It probably literally translates into Greek fire, but we'll figure that out later. The Turk then came back. So he snuck up through the incendiary and snuck back down. Another Turk climbed up and walked along the parapet with a sword and a shield. From the tower that had the horsemen in it, from the tower that had the horsemen in its doorway, there came against him one of their men wearing a double hauberk, spear in hand, but no shield. So we have a mismatched sort of combat that's about to occur. So we have a escalating Turk who has sword and shield, which is a good combination if you're trying to maneuver and get up somewhere. It's difficult to carry something big like a spear. And then out of the tower comes a heavily armored Crusader. It says he has a double hauberk. So is that 2 layers of mail, or is that something like a heavy gambeson underneath a hauberk of mail? Unclear, but we've heard references in sources to double mail. This guy just says double hauberk, and a spear in hand but no shield. The Turk met him, sword in hand, and the Frank thrust his spear at him, but the Turk pushed the spearhead away from him with his shield and stepped forward to his enemy, putting himself in where the Frank's spear had been. So he pushes the spear away and then closes. So the Frank spun away from him, turning and bending his back like a man at prayer. So he feels he's getting close, and then maybe he spins and ducks down. We've got some pretty cool Hollywood action going on over here. Out of fear for his head. So he retreats, pulls back his spear, and then sensing that he's going to be swung at, he spins and ducks. This is making for a pretty good choreography. The Turk struck him with a number of blows, none of which had any effect. So again, this is sword on armor, and in this case, the armor seems to be doing its job. He then walked on until he entered the tower, where our men outnumbered and overpowered him and his comrades. The Franks then delivered the citadel and the captives and came down to the tents of Bursuk. So there's a situation where we have a pretty cool little bit. It didn't say specifically what type of sword the Turk had. It's possible he had a long saber. It's possible he just had a safe. So the kind of straight style Muslim sword. Both are possible at this time, but the Frank had enough sense that he knew that he was at risk for sword blows, especially against the head. And he tried to protect himself even though he didn't have a shield on himself. It sounds like he did suffer several blows from the attacking Turk, but that wherever they landed, they didn't seem to score enough damage to significantly debilitate him or injure him, and he was able to withdraw. This is a type of uneven combat that we've heard discussed in, theoretically we've seen practice in HEMA. So one person with a long spear against sword and shield. In many cases, that is suggested that the sword and shield user have a bit of an advantage against the single spearmen. Against massed spearmen, against ranks of spearmen, the situation is potentially different. But in this case, that does seem to be the case, that the shield allows the swordsman to be able to engage the spear and close to a distance that the tip of the spear no longer can be brought to bear, and the swordsman can get close and start to work on him. In this case, it sounds like the fact that he was heavily armored was able to keep him from otherwise getting butchered. Let's move on. All right, so now we read an account of between Malik and Abu Musayyak. Malik said to him, "Bah, Abu Musayyak, after converting to Islam and reciting the Quran, you return to unbelief?" "Get away from me, Malik," said Abu Musayyak. "The Muslim forbid wine, and I cannot do without it." "Well then," said Malik, "do you agree to a duel?" "I do," replied Abu Musayyak. So they fought with spears, and they fought with swords. Abu Musayyak struck Malik with a blow that split his head open and caused his eyelids to droop. Because of that blow, Malik was named the Droopy-Eyed. Malik retreated to his camp, holding tight the neck of his horse. A group of his kinsmen and friends gathered around him, crying. Malik said to one of them, "Put your hand in my mouth." The man put his finger in Malik's mouth, and he bit down on it, and the man writhed in pain. So Malik said, "Nothing wrong with your man. Sound teeth, sound head. It's been said, just packing it," meaning the moon, wound with flour and wrap it with turban cloth. Once they packed it and wrapped it up, he said, "Get my horse." "Where are you going?" they asked. "To Abu Musayyak." Malik then stepped forward in challenge between the two ranks and shouted, "Abu Musayyak!" And Abu Musayyak shot toward him like an arrow, but Malik struck him on the shoulder with his sword, splitting him in two to his saddle, killing him. Malik then returned to his camp and remained there for 40 days, unable to move. But then he recovered and was healed of his wound. So there you have some nice 12th century medicine for a head wound. When in doubt, pack it with flour and wrap it in turban cloth. So someone survived a head strike with a wound and apparently recovered enough that he was able to get out back there and deal a very decisive sword blow that hit the guy here, and it says it struck him down to the saddle. So that's a big strike across the chest. Doesn't say how heavily armored the other guy was, but it sounds like a pretty decisive blow. Here is an account that's very short, and it doesn't actually mention swords, but it's still worth mentioning. One of the most spectacular spear thrusts that I witnessed was inflicted by a horseman from the Franks. May God confound them. On a horseman from our troops, called Usama ibn Munqidh from the Kalib tribe. It cut through 3 rib bones on his left side, and then through 3 on his right side. Finally, the sharp edge of the spear head stuck his elbow joint, splitting it in 2 just like a butcher does the joint of meat. He died instantly. So in this case, he's talking about a guy running him through. And it's worth mentioning, I'm not talking about every battlefield account that Usama is going to mention. In general, he is going to mention encounters, bellicose encounters, starting almost always with the spear or the lance. So there's many more of those which I'm not going to mention just because the focus of my interest is in talking about the function of swords. So most of the time they start with spears and then maybe it'll devolve into swords after that. In this case, he's commending this big crusader for dealing an incredible strike. So this sounds like a strike that was way out of the ordinary to go all the way through the torso and to, it sounds like, cut off the other guy's arm. So there are all sorts of different types of spearhead. Some of them are very narrow and pointy. Some of them are good for thrusting through gaps. Other of them are very broad, wide, and have cleaving heads. And it sounds like this one was a cleaving head. And he says it split the elbow joint in 2 just like a butcher does a joint of meat. And the guy died instantly. Okay, here he recounts an attack on a caravan. Another example. There was a man in my service called No.1 al-Azuri, an infantryman courageous and strong. With a band of infantrymen from Shaizar, he set out for Al-Ruj to attack the Franks. While in the region of town, they stumbled across a Frankish caravan and camped in a cavern. So each one said to the other, "Who's going to go against them?" No.1 said, "I will," and handed his comrades his sword and shield. Drawing forth his dagger, he's engaging in roguelike behavior. He went to the enemy. One of them came to confront him, but he struck him with his dagger, threw him down, and knelt on him to kill him. So, however this went down, I guess he wasn't sneaky enough, and he was able to pounce on him and start to dagger him. Behind him stood another Frank with a sword, and he struck No.1, but No.1 was wearing a rucksack on his back with bread in it. He's going to attack these guys while carrying a backpack. Anyway, and this cushioned the blow. Of the many different ways I've heard of armoring yourself against swords, I've never heard of armoring yourselves with bread. This may be a personal first. Maybe I'm going to have to do that as a new sword cutting test. How effective is protecting yourself from a sword blow with bread? Rucksack full of bread. All right. No.1 was wearing a rucksack on his back with bread in it, and it cushioned the blow. Once he had killed the man that was pinned underneath him, he turned toward the Frank with the sword and made for him. The Frank struck him with the sword on the side of his face, cutting him through his brow, his eyelid, his cheek, his nose, and his upper lip, causing the whole side of his face to hang down onto his chest. So No.1 left the caravan, and returned to his comrades, who bound his wound and returned with him through a cold and rainy night, arriving at Shaizar while he was still in that condition. His face was stitched back up and his wounds were treated, so he recovered and returned to how he had been, except that his eye was gone. He was one of the 3 men with whom Ismailis threw from Shaizar citadel that we mentioned earlier. So eventually he got thrown off of a tower. But that's interesting. So this guy went sneaking up to a caravan and he thought he was going to take them. It says that he specifically handed over his sword and shield. I assume that was because they were going to make too much noise and he wanted to take them by surprise. Otherwise, why would you leave behind your primary arms? He went in with just a dagger. Again, this is a question that comes up frequently. Would you ever want to be the guy attacking someone else with just a dagger when the other guys have more powerful arms? I don't think that he saw the Franks having more powerful arms and decided, yeah, I think I can take him with just a dagger. That seems foolhardy. So my assumption is that he was going to sneak around and do some Assassin's Creed type work and just sneakily stab them and be done with it and not bring the scabbard and shield because it would encumber him sneaking around and make way too much noise. That's the only thing that makes sense the way I'm reading the text. And because as soon as he confronts someone that actually has a sword, it goes very poorly for him and he immediately retreats with half of his face hanging off of his head. So yeah, can you take someone with a sword if you just have a dagger? We have many treatises on how to try to do it, but it's a very tall order and not one that I would personally want to have to try and take. Here's just a very short account that's talking about how Usama girded himself. So they're traveling from one area to another, and it says, Al-Yagasiyani's messenger came to me during the night to say, "Saddle up." My tent was next to his. He had already mounted and was positioned in front of his tent. I mounted up that very instant, and he asked me, "Did you know already that I had saddled up?" "No, by God," I said. At which point he said, "But I just now sent the order for you, and yet you're mounted and ready this instant." "My lord," I replied, "my horse always eats his barley, and then my groom bridles him and sits at the door of my tent with the reins in his hand. Meanwhile, I put on my gear and strap on my sword and sleep. When your messenger came to me, there was nothing to delay me." Al-Yagasiyani remained in his place until a part of the army had assembled before him, and then said, "Put on your armor." Most of the men present did so while I stood by his side. Then he said, "How many times do I have to say, 'Put on your armor'?" "My lord," I said, "you don't mean me." "Yes," he said. "By God," I objected, "I can't put on anything more. It is still the early part of the night, and my kazagand has 2 layers of mail. When I see the enemy, I'll put it on." Al-Yagasiyani fell silent, and we started out. So in this case, Usama is boasting a little bit that he is always prepared, that he sleeps even with his sword strapped on, and that he has one of the heavier configurations of armor, and he decided not to put it on right that second just because I guess it would be too heavy, and that it probably goes on very quickly, and everyone else has lighter configurations of armor and can go in it. Here's the coda to that account. But no sooner had we set foot on the ground than he said, "Where is your Kazagand armor?" At my order, my attendant brought it out. I took it out of its leather bag, and pulling out my knife, I ripped open a bit at its chest, and revealed the side with 2 coats of mail. It had a Frankish coat of mail extending to the hem, with another above it extending as far as the middle. Both had all the linings, felt pads, rough silk, and rabbit fur. Al-Yagasiyani then turned to one of his attendants and said something to him in Turkish. I didn't understand what he was saying. The servant presently brought before Al-Yagasiyani a horse that the Atabeg, which is like a sergeant, had given him once upon a time, a dark chestnut charger looking like a block of granite quarried from the summit of the mountain. "This horse," he said to his attendant, "befits that Kazagan, give it to the attendant of this man. And so he delivered it to the attendant of yours truly. So because Usama had such a fancy coat of armor, he was able to leverage a nicer horse out of the deal by showing it off. And not too bad, even for if he had to cut off some of the silk to show what was underneath. Here, Usama tells us about a tale of sword blows. The blow of the mangonel stone upon that old man's head, may God have mercy upon him, has reminded me of the blows of sharp swords. Here is an example. When the Ismailis made an attempt on the citadel of Shaizar, one of our comrades called Hammam the pilgrim encountered one of Ismailis in a portico in the residence of my uncle. May God have mercy upon him. The Ismailis had a knife in his hand, and Hammam had a sword. The Batini charged at him with his knife, but Hammam struck him with his sword above the eyes. He cut through the top of his skull, and his brains fell out, splattering and spreading out on the ground. Hammam then threw the sword from his hand and vomited up everything in his stomach, stricken with nausea at seeing those brains. On the same day, one of them came at me with a long knife in his hand. While I had one of my swords, he charged at me with his knife, but I struck him in the middle of his forearm as he grasped the handle of his knife, its blade held back close to the raised arm. So I'm all out of knives right now, but he's holding the knife in an ice pick grip, and the knife is a long knife, and he's protecting his forearm with it in a defensive posture. He charged at me with his knife, but I struck him in the middle of his forearm as he grasped the handle of the knife, its blade held back close to his raised arm. At a length of 4 finger widths was cut from the blade of the knife, and his forearm was cut in half, clean off. The traces of the knife blade remained ever afterward on the edge of my sword. An artisan in our town saw it and said, "I can get rid of that dent there." But I said, leave it as is. It's the best thing about that sword. Even today, when someone looks at that sword, they know it has the mark of that knife. So this is a case where we see it all the time. We see it in other written accounts. We see it in period artwork of one blade breaking another blade, or one blade cleaving through another blade. In this case, it's a much larger blade cleaving through a smaller blade, which in some ways is more likely. If the knife is thin, if the knife is sharp, and the sword is being swung with a lot of force, which it certainly seems to, this certainly could happen. But notice that the sword does not make it through unscathed. The sword has some type of a mark on it. It says that traces of the knife blade remained ever afterwards on the edge of my sword. And we see this in modern tests, even with high quality, high made replicas. A sword coming into contact with another edge, even a much smaller, weaker, inferior blade, is almost invariably going to have some type of edge damage. And he's going about town, he's talking to other swordsmiths, they're offering to fix the blade. He says, no, I want to keep it. I want to remember that. And that also happens in some culture. And in Japanese culture, for instance, if there are chips or bite marks on the back of katana, on the spine, on the mune, those are left in and are considered very prestigious. Those are marks of honor that show that the blade has been through battle, survived the battle, kept the owner alive, and are something to be respected. If they're on the edge, on the ha, usually they are polished out, because that's a risk of propagating the crack and damaging the sword. So it's interesting that Usama has that account for us here of cutting through a knife and through the poor guy's arm as well. Here's an account of how the sword al-Jami'i got its name. The same sword has another tale I will tell. My father, may God have mercy upon him, had a groom called Jami. Once the Franks made a raid upon us, and my father put on his Kazgand armor and left his house to mount up. But he could not find his horse, so he stood there for a while waiting. Eventually, Jami, the groom who had been delayed, arrived with his horse. My father struck him with this same sword while it was still hanging from his waist in its scabbard. He just took it while it was still scabbarded. So here, we'll put it in its scabbard with all its trappings. Took it while it's in its scabbard and struck the groom. The blade cut through the scabbard trappings, the silver scabbard chape, and the thick garment and the woolen mantle that the groom was wearing, and then through the bone of his elbow. His forearm fell to the ground. As a result, my father, may God have mercy upon him, supported this groom and his children after him on account of this wound. That sword was named Al-Jami'i, after the groom. So the sword, in a fit of anger, he bonked the groom. Obviously, he bonked him a little bit harder, but he struck the groom, and the groom put up his arm, presumably to defend himself. And even though it was scabbarded, again, these scabbards are often wood-lined and then have leather or felt covering. Does it say what it has? Silver scabbard tip, and then thick garment. It doesn't say what else it had, but it just says scabbard trappings. So again, they're usually wood core, covered then by some type of hide, if not felt or cloth. But they're quite thin. So yeah, they're reasonably easy to destroy, and the weight of the blade and the sharp edge, if you strike something hard enough, that blade's going to continue doing what it's doing, and that wasn't enough padding to prevent the poor victim from being seriously injured. It says his forearm fell to the ground, so presumably it still cut off the limb. Don't fool around with sharp swords, guys. It'll still have consequences. And finally, we have an encounter that has nothing to do with swords, but this scene is just so good that someone needs to read this account and put it in a movie, because this is just comedic gold. Indeed, every act in which reason is absent results in error and failure. Here is an example. Once the Franks encamped against Hama in its fields, in which there was a fat harvest of corn. They pitched their tents right in the midst of the harvest. Now a group of robbers came out of Shaizar to reconnoiter the Frankish army and rob them. They noticed their tents were pitched in the corn. So the next morning, one of them went before the Lord of Hama and said, "Tonight I will burn up the entire Frankish army." "If you do that," replied the Lord, "I will cover you with honors." Once evening fell, the robber went out with a group of like-minded companions. They started the fire in the corn west of the tents, so the breeze would drive the flames towards the tents of the enemies. Thanks to the light of the fire, the night became like day. So the Franks caught sight of them and rushed towards them and killed most of them. Only those who threw themselves in the river and swam over to the other side managed to escape. So here we see the impact of ignorance and its consequences. So that's just some spectacular comedy and would have been wonderful to watch from across the river. Oh man, brilliant idea. Light fire to the camp in the middle of the night. No one will see it coming. Great idea, guys. This is an account that doesn't discuss swords, but it's still kind of fun to hear what happens in the midst of battle. My uncle Sultan, may God have mercy upon him, went to join Il-Ghazi. My father, may God have mercy upon him, remained behind in the castle at Shaizar. A few days after my uncle's departure, the town crier called us to arms. I set out at the head of a small group, barely amounting to 20 horsemen, all of us convinced that Aptamea had no cavalry stationed in it. I also brought along a large body of pillagers and Bedouin. But as soon as we arrived at Wadi Abu al-Mayun, and the pillagers and Arab tribesmen had scattered over the fields, a large contingent of Franks came out and attacked us. With the horse beneath me and as fleet as a bird, I continued on the heels of my enemies, sometimes attacking with my spear, sometimes maneuvering away from them as for cover. In the Frankish rearguard was a horseman on a black horse, as big as a camel. He was wearing a mail hauberk and a gambeson. I was afraid of him, thinking he might try and lure me further along so he could turn on me and attack, until I saw him spur his horse onward and twitch its tail. I knew then it had become exhausted, so I attacked, running my spear through him such that it stuck out nearly a cubit in front of him. So almost 2 feet in front of him the spear went through. Thanks to the lightness of my body, the force of the spear thrust, and the speed of my horse, I was bumped backward from the seat of my saddle. Turning back, I pulled my spear from him, assuming I had killed him. I then assembled my comrades and found them safe and sound. So, skipping ahead a little bit, and now skipping ahead a little bit more. After a few days, my uncle, may God have mercy upon him, returned from his visit to Ilgasi. May God have mercy upon him. His messenger came to summon me at a time that was not his usual time for such a meeting. So I went to him, and who should I see but some Frankish men? My uncle said, "This horseman has come from Apamea, wishing to set eyes upon the cavalier who speared the horseman Philip, for the Franks are amazed by that spear thrust, which pierced 2 layers of horseman's armor, yet he survived." "But how?" I cried. "How could he have survived?" "The blow," the Frankish knight explained, "only pierced the skin at his waist." "Fate is indeed an impenetrable fortress," I replied, for it seemed unimaginable to me that he could have survived that spear thrust. Thus I say that whoever is about to thrust a spear should clasp it tightly to his side with his hand in his forearm, and let his horse do what it does in such a situation. For if he move his hand with the spear or extend it out with it, his thrust will have no effect and do no damage. So this is his takeaway from that situation. It's like, if you're getting ready to hit someone while charging with your lance, don't move your arm, don't extend it, don't try and do anything, because you're going to go off target. So he made it through apparently 2 layers of armor, and the Crusaders were really impressed and wanted to find out about this Arab who was able to successfully skewer the knight. But the knight did survive because it went through his side and only clipped him through all the armor. It didn't go through the center of his gut. An amazing spear thrust indeed. Okay, so I hope everyone enjoyed this little walk through history. This is, again, a really spectacular account from basically a first-hand author, a man who lived to be over 90 years old and see the beginning of Salah ad-Din's consolidation of power, lived through the First Crusades and basically the start of where the Second Crusade, the setting for when the Third Crusade would have started to kick off. So if anyone's interested, I highly recommend trying to get yourself a copy of the Book of Contemplations, Islam and the Crusades. There's lots more to dig into there. He covers all manner of topics. Talks about how convivial at times the Franks and the local Islamic population is. Again, this point of history is very complicated. Politics gets into it. Everyone is vying for their own little political interests, their own little claims to fame. They can be surprisingly accommodating of one another's cultures and religions, even when they need to go up and after one another. So whoever is ruling a town may have all sorts of different faiths and cultures represented, and the rulers oftentimes will be very accommodating of all of the people under them. But Usama has lots of great commentaries on all of these people and cultures that he's encountering as he travels throughout the Levant and beyond during this time period. So hope you guys enjoyed it, and we'll take a look at some more swords next time. Take care.